Dear learners, welcome back. Now we are into week 4, and in this week we'll be discussing unit 4 of the SLM and the different aspects related to SLM. The different aspects related to that unit 4, and that is budgeting. So we'll be talking about in different sessions about budgeting, about classification of budgets, and about the techniques of budgeting. So in this case, what we'll be doing is, in the first session we would be discussing budgeting. The second session we would be discussing the classification of budgets and then the techniques of budgeting. There is an additional material here in these sessions, and so you can have a better understanding of the budgeting. So the unit is the prelude and it just gives a brief idea about what budgeting is. In this we will be discussing more of the technicalities of the budgeting. So when we talk about budgeting or the budget, so what happens is that we have it in mind that as an individual also we have to plan something to spend the money. So when we talk about budgeting, it is the process of creating a plan for spending the money. And what happens is, whatever amount we have, we need to utilize it properly and we need to carve out these certain expenditures. Now, as an individual, suppose I want to spend the budget for I want to plan a budget for the household. So what will I do? First of all, I'll just keep away some money for the help in the house, then some money for the ration, the groceries, the food items, and some money for exigencies, some extra money for planning if it is required in future in that particular month. I'm talking about the monthly budget in this sense. So this is a process of creating a plan for spending the money. And then you have to plan the future expenditures. So as I gave you an example of the monthly budget, in monthly budget you are planning the future and you are trying to find out what the expenditure would be, what kind of expenditures would incur in the future. So forecasting the usage of revenue to curb the expenses. Now if you don't have a planned budget, then what happens is more than the revenue, the expenses happen and you don't realize that the money has gone. So that is why it is essential to forecast that this much amount may be required for a certain expenditure. So that is forecasting. Then you have allocation of expenses for achieving the future goals. It also involves the preparation and implementation of budget. We also need to understand what is the importance of budgeting. I gave you an example of an individual. In this, we'll be trying to find out the importance of budgeting. It shows what the organization is trying to achieve. As we discussed earlier in the accounts part in the legal section, that the financial health of the organization is important. To know the financial health is important. So that is why the organization, what is the position of the organization financially? That is why we need to know the budgeting aspects. So importance of budgeting when we talk about is, it shows what the organization is trying to achieve. It provides clarity and transparency to the management and what should be done. It gives the direction to an organization. It helps in governing the cash flow. It also helps in aligning the expenditure with the forecasted revenue and hence preventing overspending. As I gave you the example earlier also, so it is required that forecasting should be done and the expenses should be aligned with the revenues. If the alignment is proper, then the overspending is not there. That means the deficit won't be reached. We talked about the surplus and deficit in the accounting aspects. So in this case, when we talk about the budgeting, we always aim for the surplus instead of the deficit. So that is why if it is a deficit, we need to see how the revenues can be increased. These are some of the advantages of budgeting, and because I'm just giving you an introductory idea about the budgeting. In other two sessions, we'll be discussing the details of the budgeting. So when we talk about the advantages of budgeting, it helps in planning the business operations, what kind of business the organization is in. So here what we are talking about the NGOs. But when we talk about the word business, it always relates to the profits of the organization or something which has a profit involved in it. And we are talking about the NGOs, which are not for profit making organizations. So you must be wondering that there is a contradictory approach, that why am I using the business operations? Now, business word is actually something operational in the sense that the organization is involved in certain activities. So that is why for NGOs also we can use the word business operations, but you keep in mind that it is for not for profit making organization. It coordinates the different functions of an organization, and there should be a clear understanding of different managerial functions. The budgeting tries to motivate the manager to achieve certain goals of the budget, and it also controls the ongoing activities of the organization. So you see, if we see the advantages, the business operations are involved, but then when you just move further, it is basically related to the functions of the organization. An organization can be of any kind, whether it is a profit-making organization or a not-for-profit-making organization. For both kinds of organization, budget is required. Budget is an essential part of the organization. So that is important to understand. It also helps in performance evaluation, evaluating the performance, improving the decision making. And decision making, when we talk about decision making, it is like it serves as the tool for evaluating the staff members. It helps in minimizing wastages and losses. It tries to bring out the efficiency and improvement of the organization. So it is important that we know what kind of a budget it is, because when we talk about advantages, it is you understand that what is happening in the organization, what kind of decisions needs to be taken. Now, if there is a proper budget, for example, now when we take an example of an NGO, suppose that NGO is working for the education of the girl child. Now in that case, they require certain funds. And when they require funds, they need to utilize those funds in an optimal manner that their goals are achieved. The targets of educating the girl children, the number of girls, how many number of girls should be educated, that needs to take in. What will be the cost of educating one girl, and multiplied, suppose it is educating 20 girls, so multiplied by 20. So all these things are important when we discuss the budget. So therefore it improves the decision making. It tries to serve as a tool for evaluating the staff members. It helps in minimizing wastages and loss as discussed earlier, and of course brings the efficiency. It makes the organization more effective, more improved in nature. Now let us discuss what is a budget. Now coming to the most crucial aspect, what is a budget? Basically, when we talk about or try to define a budget, it is a plan expressed in monetary terms. It is a form of quantitative forecast of future expenditure. It is prepared for a specific time frame. Usually it is prepared for a year, but to understand the intricacies of the operational issues arising in an NGO, then it can be prepared in the short term also. We'll see the classification later. So you can prepare it for the quarterly budget also, or say semi-annual budgets also. But the final budget is usually prepared for a year. And it is a systematic plan which utilizes the available resources effectively, and it tries to represent the expected income and the expected expenses that may arise in a specific period of time. Now, when we see the types of budget, it is important to understand that what kind of budget is required for the NGO. So when we talk about the budget, the types of budget, it can be a capital budget, it can be an operative budget. So you know what operations are, you know what is the capital amount now, because you've just gone through the accounting sessions also. So when we talk about the types of budget, there are two kinds of budgets. One is the capital budget and one is the operative budget. What is a capital budget then? It is meant to include capital expenditure of an organization. What is a capital expenditure? That is important to understand. For example, the budgeting expenses related to expansion of a building or purchase of a vehicle. So even in NGOs, the vehicles are required. Now I can give you an example of an organization, Akshay Patra. When they started their meal program, they were given they did not purchase a vehicle, but the vehicle was donated to them. But after the vehicle was donated to them to take the meals, the maintenance of vehicle was important. The fuel, the service done for the vehicle, etc. So that involved expenses. So that can also come under capital budget. So it is meant to include capital expenditure of an organization, and it involves forecasting expenses which leads to a creation of an asset. Now, when the donation comes, then it is not a creation of an asset. It is like getting the asset through the donation. But maintaining that asset becomes the operational activity. So that is why it is important to understand that what kind of budget it is, whether it is a capital budget or an operating budget. So it involves forecasting expenses which leads to creation of an asset. It involves expenditures of non-recurring nature. So I gave you the example of maintenance activities that is recurring in nature, but purchasing of one time, that is non-recurring in nature. So it usually requires dedicated funds for undertaking such expenditures, and the example as given is buying a land or a vehicle or some kind of an asset which is required for the organization. Now coming to the operating budget. It is meant to include the revenue expenditure of an organization, and it involves forecasting expenses which lead to daily operation of an organization. It involves expenditures of recurring nature. I talked about the maintenance part. It involves expenditures of recurring nature, and these expenditures can be raised out of general funds, not from the capital funds. For example, expenses related to maintenance of building or refueling a vehicle, as I gave you the example. So purchasing becomes the capital part, maintaining becomes the operating part in this case. These are some of the features of a budget. Budget is prepared on the basis of past expenditures, what has been spent, say in the last year. Keeping that in mind as the blueprint, the future budget is prepared. And forecasting is done related to the financial position of the organization, and it is prepared for a specific time period. It is written and approved by appropriate authority, that is important to understand, and it sets the standards for measuring the performance of the organization. Here we have used the word business performance. Again, I would stress it is the performance of the organization. So the organization can be in any kind of activity. And it estimates the economic activities of the organization, which is important to understand. Now let us see what are the different components of the budget. When we talk about the budget, there are three basic components of the budget. One is the projected cash flow, the second is the cost, and third is the revenue. So you have three components, and these components, they formulate a budget. The total budget is formulated by these components. One is the projected cash flow, the other is the cost, and the other is the revenue. Of course, when there is cost incurred, there would be revenue also, then only you can incur the cost. So there should be incoming and outgoing both in the budget. Now, what is a projected cash flow? When we talk about the budget, it should have estimates for future cash position, that this much cash is there, it is available, this much cash may come from some sources. And it should be reviewed at regular intervals, because through this cash only the expenditures are made. When we talk about the cost, there are two types of costs. One is the fixed cost and the other is the variable cost. Usually the fixed cost is a kind of a cost which remains constant irrespective of change in amount of goods and services such as office rent. Whereas there is a variable cost, and the cost which varies with the amount of goods and services. For example, the telephone bills. For example, the cost of raw materials. Now you would be questioning why the cost of raw material comes out to be a variable cost. Suppose there is a rise in the raw material market, the prices of the raw material increase. Then whenever you purchase that, the supplier is going to give you the raw material at a higher price. So the cost of raw material also comes under the variable cost. The estimates of the costs, they are usually based on previous year expenditure, and the quotes for the suppliers are gathered, and then only the budget is prepared. When we talk about the third component of a budget, the third component is the revenue, and it is based on the sales record or subscription fees and donations of the organization. The estimates of the revenues, they are basically based on previous year income and future estimate of income, that what was the income in the earlier year and what will be the income in the future through different sources of the organization. So this is how the revenue is being forecasted. Now, these are some of the key indicators for budget preparation. We'll just go through it. One is the goal setting. Setting up of a definite plan of organization is the first set, and that is very important because when we talk about strategic management, that we did it in the first course, that is Introduction to NGO Management, it is very important to have a proper strategy for the organization or an NGO. And this document should give details of the powers, the duties, the activities which are important for the key officials. The second one is the budget settlement, and budget needs to be settled in discussion with the various department heads, because one person doesn't know what is happening in different departments. Now suppose the HR department is trying to recruit people. So HR department knows how many people will be recruited, what is the salary, what is the how many staff is there, or what amount of salary is to be dispersed, etc. So that is one department. So that is why budget needs to be settled in discussion with various department heads. As an example, case of purchase budget for a year. If it is a purchase budget, all the departments needs to be assessed before purchase budget is finalized, because you need to know where the amount has to be purchased from. The third part is the budget period. This is again a prerequisite. You need to have a definite time frame for preparing the budget, and usually the budget period is fixed for a year. However, the better control, the period could be quarterly or monthly, as I discussed earlier also. When we talk about the forecasting part, the forecasting income and expenses, budget is prepared on the information of income and expense. For example, NGOs have donations and grants as their income. The funds are coming through donations and grants, and they incur expenses on deploying programs for welfare activities. So this is the income and expenses for NGOs. Other part is project-wise budgeting. In NGOs, this is very important. Specifically, this is meant for NGOs because in big corporate and business houses, again, there is project-wise budgeting. But for NGOs, this function is very important. Because NGOs, they work, they get the funds based on the projects or the project proposal they submit to the funding organization. And therefore, it will help the organization to prepare a project-wise budgeting to plan, to control the operation project-wise. When we talk about the budgeting of NGOs, it is very important for them for raising the funds, planning the future projects. Proper and planned budget is required for convincing a donor to donate for a specific cause. And donor financing is limited and NGOs have to compete for their funding, as I discussed in the project-wise budgeting part. So budget act as business pitches for attracting the donors. That is very important. So that is why a proper budget is required for NGOs. The budgets do help in providing transparency and accountability in all kinds of financial activities, and they are required by different stakeholders of NGOs. Budgets can help an NGO in determining the extent of their project implementation. Budgets can also be used as a tool for evaluating the success of a project, and it can help in effective allocation of resources for a project. So this is all about budget. And I'm going to give you a reference. You just go through this site, the internationalbudget.org, where you will find all the details and different kinds of details related to budgeting for the governments, related to NGOs. And this is a very useful document, and when you go through it and read it, you'll find this has been done, though the document is little old, but it is still applicable. So you can just go through this reference. Now this is just a cursory glance towards what a budget is, and in the next session we would be trying to find out what kinds of budgets are there. Thank you so much.